The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is the long-awaited expanded reimagining of the Stanley Parable, an interactive comedy-adventure video game originally released in 2011. The game follows Stanley, a silent protagonist who is accompanied by an omnipresent narrator who provides directions for what Stanley is supposed to do next in the story. At the beginning of the game, we learn that Stanley is employee number 427 in a large office building, and his role is to follow the directions on a computer screen and press whatever buttons the monitor tells him to without question. One day, Stanley stops receiving information on his computer, and when he goes outside to investigate, he discovers that the office building is mysteriously abandoned, and he, apart from the narrator, seems to be the only person left in his workplace. This is where the real twist to the game begins. The narrator vocalizes Stanley's confusion and guides him to a hallway with 2 doors. As I noted earlier, the narrator provides directions for what Stanley is supposed to do next in the narrative. But the player who controls Stanley has the choice to diverge from the narrator's expectations of what Stanley is to do next. The narrator, of course, reacts to Stanley's defiance or obedience, and accordingly changes his narration to fit the given situation, as seen in these examples.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it. Yes, truly a room worth admiring. It had really been worth the detour after all, just to spend a few moments here in this immaculate, beautifully constructed room. But eager to get back to business, Stanley took the first open door on his left. Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago.
Every time Stanley contradicts the narrator usually tries to steer him towards the narrator's desired path. But again, it's the player's choice on whether or not they want to listen to him. This leads to a multitude of different endings for the game depending upon all of the player's actions. And if this premise sounds somewhat familiar to you, then it should if you watch a lot of TV. The original Stanley Parable was so popular that it served as one of the inspirations for Apple TV's 2022 hit TV show Severance, a mystery thriller show in which memory-altered workers must unflinchingly listen to their corporate overlords without questioning what it is they do on their computers. But as much as I love Severance, and as much as I'd love to talk about that show, I'm actually here to compare the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe to the expansive catalogue of A24 films. And that might seem weird to you, considering that the Stanley Parable is a piece of art communicated within a completely different medium from movies, and the fact that it seems odd to compare one game to a vast number of films A24 has produced with different plots and contexts. But stick with me for a moment. A24 is well known for producing and distributing high-quality, artistically minded films with excellent stories that aren't afraid to take risks. And because of these risks, all A24 films in general can be described as having a distinctly unique style and aesthetic to them that I can only describe as A24. If you've seen an A24 film, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't seen an A24 movie, then the best way I can describe it is that the director's unrestrained vision takes precedence over all else. And this is a good thing. Artists should have full creative control over their projects. This cohesive, unaltered vision quite often leads to wonderful artistic triumphs. But this same artistic freedom is also why A24 movies are notorious for their weird vibes.
sick of you laughing, snoring, and your goddamn farts. Your goddamn farts!
A24 obviously doesn't have a monopoly on artistic integrity and brilliance. Nor are they the only production company that produces weird-ass movies. But A24 is so excellent at curating these specific styles of film that I can't help but use them as a reference point for thoughtfully produced, exquisitely weird art. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is exactly that. It's incredibly intelligent with some of the most insightful commentary on player choice and agency I've ever seen in a video game, while at the same time being so fucking weird. For example, you have powerful and insightful scenes like this one, where the narrator fluidly challenges your preconceived notions of player choice. In this scene, Stanley has just pressed the button to presumably take over the mind control facility for his own uses, but the narrator tells him that the button is instead going to blow up the facility and kill Stanley. And this scene is so genius. My first instinct was to try and stop the countdown timer by pressing a bunch of buttons and hoping it would work. But the game anticipates your familiarity with standard game design, and shows you how games manipulate you into a false sense of freedom, when you're really just being railroaded into specific actions. Games expect you to try and find a solution to things. That's why the narrator just laughs in your face after you've walked around wasting your time trying to fruitlessly press buttons in order to save yourself. You are ultimately constrained to the game's will. Now, just like an A24 film, the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe isn't just brilliant and insightful and stylistically impressive. Like I said before, it's really weird. For example, there's this path you can take in the game that puts you into a situation where it implies that you're going to fuck a bucket, and the narrator falls in love with it and wants to fuck it too. It's just pure, unadulterated insanity. I want to make this clear. This game is an absurd, self-aware, tongue-in-cheek comedy. So it is, of course, inevitably going to be weird by nature. But like A24 movies, it's an unrestrained kind of weird where the freedom of its weirdness is a clear part of the work's entire cohesive vision. And that vision is something I'd like to take a deeper look at. Rather than analyzing everything that the Stanley Parable is about, however, I want to instead take a look at just a few aspects about the game that I found especially entertaining or powerful or fun. The reason I'm not going over every detail is that the game already flat out tells you what it's about since it's just so satirical. And the game is even self-aware enough to the point that it often provides you with an analysis of itself.
The Stanley Parable is both a richly stimulating commentary on the nature of choice in games and one that offers some of the most enjoyable, surprising, and rewarding choices I've ever been confronted with in a game, 9 out of 10.
I don't want to simplify the game's themes and commentary, because the game is far more complex than what's said on the surface. But it basically boils down to an examination of the player's relationship to games, and how the choices they make within them are not quite as independently driven as it might seem. But, again, the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is so much more than that. So let's revel in its art and see just why I think this game is as phenomenal as an A24 film. As I said earlier, I wanted to take a deeper look at the Stanley Parable's creative vision. Much like how A24 films wield their artistic freedom, The Stanley Parable uses its freedom to break the mold of traditional video game design in a groundbreaking and unique way. It isn't constrained by the typical conventions of game and narrative design. It even purposefully seeks to counter those conventions by continually challenging your idea of what player agency is. There's this moment in the game where something called the adventure line is introduced. The adventure line, as a concept, is the imaginary line that a video game encourages you to follow in order to experience its adventures. That's why it's called the adventure line. The Stanley Parable satirizes that concept by making the player blindly follow a literal yellow adventure line that goes in odd and weird directions. This shows that no matter how you follow this line, and no matter how twisty it gets, you still end up at a certain predetermined point. And not only are your choices guided by the game's will and not your own, but your choices are ultimately a futile attempt at player freedom. There's this brilliant juxtaposition between the game's pure freedom and the player's apparent lack of it. The Stanley Parable emphasizes the artist's freedom to do what they want, which is why the narrator is able to change everything on a whim. The player, instead, is merely a passenger in all of these stories. And that isn't a bad thing. Just like the game has its job to tell a story, it's the player's job to consume it. That relationship between the game and the player is an important one. We've been talking a lot about artistic freedom throughout this video, and I think this upcoming point is the most important aspect of it that I want to address. Players are consumers, and consumers inevitably expect a certain quality out of the things they purchase. So if there are bugs, people will be mad. If the story sucks, people will be mad. If the gameplay is awful, people will be mad. Basically, people will be mad at a game for a lot of things, and they'll justifiably, or not justifiably, ask for changes to be made to the game in order to make it, in their eyes, better. People do this with all sorts of media and art they consume. They'll say that a TV show should have killed off a specific character in the first season. They'll say that a certain singer shouldn't have been featured in a song. They'll say that a movie should have ended differently. And I think that everyone has a right to express their dislike of any piece of art that didn't quite hit home with them. But their suggestions shouldn't come at the expense of the message that the artist is attempting to communicate. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong to criticize a game or any piece of art, because all artists should certainly be open to feedback. But what I am saying is that artists create their art for a reason, and the consumer should not get in the way of that particular purpose. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, in its never-ending quest to reassert its artistic freedom, directly addresses this phenomenon. As I said at the beginning of this video, this game is a sequel to the original Stanley Parable, and it sets out to answer the question, what should a sequel be like? Of course, the nature of sequels always tends to gravitate towards one specific goal. How can we improve upon the formula of the previous installment? And that's what the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe's narrator tries to do. He brings Stanley to the new content facility, where he talks about addressing common complaints about the first game and what his solutions are for those complaints. And when the narrator puts all those solutions together to create the perfect sequel, he realizes that something is wrong.
Okay, yes, this is much better. I feel good about this. Here we go. Version 2. Who am I kidding, Stanley? This isn't a coherent video game at all. It's a lot of gags. And I do very much enjoy creating gags, but they don't add up to anything.
He talks about how the game isn't coherent anymore, and he wants the sequel to capture the magic of the first game. And that's a problem that all sequels face. When a developer tries to pander to the whims of the players, this can become a detriment to the art itself. As the narrator said, the game is no longer cohesive, and that's because the game's cohesive vision gets disrupted by the conflicting visions of other people. Artists shouldn't be bound to what the people want, because people want different things. And when an artist is constrained to the wills of thousands of different people and not to their own creativity, the art that they're creating is no longer in their own vision. And when that happens, the art suffers. This is best shown during a sequence of the game where the narrator discovers some negative Steam reviews of the Stanley Parable.
Okay, let's see what this one says. While the idea for the game is good, for someone who prefers non-linear games, this preachiness gets annoying fast. Preachy? Stanley? I'm not preachy, am I? You can tell me if I'm preachy. Honestly, you can. Oh, goodness. This is actually quite shocking for me. To be honest, I had always thought of the game's dialogue as being rather terse to begin with. You can't know how much fluff I cut from the game to get it to feel as light and airy as it... Well, I always thought it did, but maybe it wasn't. What's this one got to say? You constantly have to stop doing anything so the narrator can catch up with his long-winded explanations of what's happening. I wish there was a skip button. A skip button? Well, yes. Yes, I think we can do that. If I'm truly too preachy, then maybe letting you skip ahead for just a moment, surely it couldn't hurt. Not if it means we can strike these negative reviews from the record. Only positive reviews of the Stanley Parable. That's my motto today, and it's always been my motto. I'd do anything for the customer, Stanley. Yes, a skip button we shall have.
The narrator starts to doubt himself and his own vision. And so, he implements one change suggested by the user Cookie9, adding a skip button. Stanley then goes on to test this new feature, and the purpose of it is to skip all of the narrator's long and preachy dialogue. The problem is, every time Stanley presses the button, the skips get longer and longer. And the narrator begins to regret this as he gets left alone during this time period. He talks about how it was a mistake for him to break something that was unbroken, all because it was to please one singular person who made one singular negative comment. But this doesn't stop Stanley though. The more dialogue you skip, the more decrepit the room becomes. And eventually, the narrator even disappears. And after a few more skips, Stanley finds himself in the ruins of a desert. And this barren wasteland is the perfect symbol for what happens when an artist's vision gets bastardized. The skip button that the narrator implemented goes against everything that the Stanley Parable stood for. Adding the skip button takes away the heart and vision of the game. And once those things are gone, the game is now a shell of what it once was. That's why it's important for artists to be able to maintain a cohesive, unaltered vision. And that's why he compared the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe to A24 films. Above all else, an unrestrained vision should be the artist's priority, even if it results in a product that not everyone is satisfied with. Because it's only with the artist's full creative control that we're able to see exactly what it is they wanted us to see. And for the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, it is a beautiful, coherent vision about the nature of choice in video games, both for the player and for the creator. The creator decides what they want in their game. The creator decides what they want in their final product. The creator decides what their vision is. And that, to me, is why I must reiterate why I'm comparing the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe to an A24 film. It is unafraid to be itself, and it achieves its vision in an unrelenting manner. It knows exactly what it is, and it expresses it in a masterful way. At first glance, the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe seems like it's just a fun little game with multiple endings. The game is loaded with so much exaggeration and satire that it might be hard to look past that initial impression of tongue-in-cheek humor and see that the game has deeper, more serious elements also worth considering. The Stanley Parable isn't just an endless barrage of gags and comedy, even though it might seem that way. And although those aspects are what make the Stanley Parable as great as it is, there are many more facets to this game that push it beyond just the level of great. From its beautiful soundtrack, to its absurd, brilliantly written narrative, and to its powerful, persistent themes about free will. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is a phenomenal game that explores the limitations of player choice. Don't miss out on this meticulously crafted experience, and please let me know in the comments down below what you thought about this unique masterpiece of a game. If you enjoyed this video essay, don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content similar to this. I make videos about all things writing related. I'd also like to thank my patron, Edith Lopez Torres, for helping make this video happen. If you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon. I'll leave a link down in the description below. And if you've got some time, check out some of my other videos too. I really appreciate you watching this one. And to everyone who made it to the end here, thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.